My guest today is Kevin Kelly, the author of 14 books, a public speaker who has delivered TED Talks with tens of millions of views, and a technology expert. In 1983, Kevin was hired by the Whole Earth founder Stewart Brand to edit several editions of the Whole Earth catalog, the Whole Earth Review, and Signal. Later on, Kevin served as the founding executive editor of the magazine Wired. In our conversation, Kevin and I talk about the scaling laws behind all technologies, but also how these laws interact with biology, society, and policy. We explore themes from what technology wants, focus on the Triad of Evolution and the concept of convergence. We connect these ideas to antitrust and innovation policy. I also touch on his earlier work, including New Rules for the New Economy, where we discuss the dynamics of trust in network economies and its implications for technology adoption. Finally, we delve into the inevitability of technological evolution, its accelerating diffusion, and what happens when technology becomes ubiquitous in society. These questions feel increasingly urgent as we approach 2025, a pivotal moment for revisiting these ideas in light of modern developments. I hope you enjoy our discussion. Kevin, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast. You've published about 14 books. I've read 5 of them for the purpose of this conversation. Now, I will mostly focus on your book entitled What Technology Wants, published in 2010, but here and there I will make references to other books, TED Talks, and short pieces that you've published. And what I thought we could do is to first discuss what you have explored at length, and that is the relationship between technology and biology, or how they complement each other, the differences between the two. And then in part 2, we could move on the scaling laws behind technology, because you have explored and compiled quite a couple. So if we start with technology versus biology, you describe what you call in the book the Triad of Evolution when it comes to life. And then we'll move on later on to technology. So the genes, the DNA is what you called the inevitable. Then there is the history, what is contingent to where you are, and then how do you adapt, right? So those are the 3 forces. Now, that applies to life and biological systems. How different would it be for technology in terms of driving what technology wants?
So the basic premise of the book is that if we look at the system of the things that we make, technologies plural, all the stuff that we make, which I called the technium, because it is a system of things, meaning you need a hammer to make a saw. And so today, for us to do anything, we need computers, we need electricity, and we have built this very, very complicated system of technologies that I call a technium. And if we look at that in the abstract over time and space, we see that it generally is obeying similar kinds of dynamics as natural evolution.
Talking about the inevitable in technology and indeed what it wants and the direction it takes, you devote a full chapter to the idea of convergence, which could be described as the phenomenon where different technologies appear at the same time in different places. You give a couple of examples. So for the listeners, this might be Darwin and Wallace coming up with similar theories of evolution at the same time without knowing each other. It might be the inkjet printer, who was invented twice in Japan by Canon and HP in the US. Now, you do actually explain that convergence is to be expected in what you call the inverted pyramid of invention. So you give a couple numbers, which are rough estimation, of course, but you say, well, look, it may be that about 10,000 people will think of the possibility of a new technology. About 1,000 people will have the idea of how to make it feasible and workable. 100 people will work the details. 10 people will actually come up with a device and one person will be in a position to make it adopted. Now, here's my question. If we transpose that to my fields, which would be antitrust and merger control, we hear sometimes that companies want to merge because they only could be in a position then to come up with a new idea. And what it seems that you are suggesting is that, well, coming up with ideas is not something that is very unique because we see convergence. What might be very unique is the ability to make it adopted. So a better defense for company would be to say, well, only if we merge, then we can make the technology adopted. And if the merger is not granted, then the technology won't be adopted. Is that a fair reading of your framework, or is it going a step too far?
Yeah, just to recap, it's technically called simultaneous independent invention, which people at first kind of imagined was rare, was a rare and kind of a coincidence, or something that didn't happen very often, where you had two people invent the same thing the same day. But it turns out, in fact, that simultaneous independent invention is the norm. And so, to your question is, yes, having ideas is just the first elementary requirement. It's necessary but not sufficient to make an invention. And so what are some of the other qualities or skills necessary for making inventions? There's just tons of them. And it's those who persevere in bringing all those additional skills and qualities besides ideas to the new invention. And so we tend to focus on the ideas, but the ideas are only part of the process of bringing something truly new and breakthrough into existence. So as we think about how to adjudicate the creative impulse, I think we want to not just focus on that one new idea that was brought to the table, but all the other necessary ideas for that invention, as well as the skills that are needed to make it happen.
So it is more complex than just arguing that a merger or IP rights will increase your capacity to invest in research and development, which is a necessary first step, but definitely not the proof that you will eventually come up with something that is successful. Now, there is something that is absolutely essential if you want your technology to be adopted, and that is trust. And that is the time for me to actually talk about another book of yours entitled New Rules for the New Economy. Now, this book was published in 1998, and in that book, you lay out 10 essential dynamics of an economy powered by networks. Now, I read the book in the last couple of weeks. I was pretty amazed, to tell you the truth, to see that pretty much all of your predictions hold true, and it almost felt like you could have published the book 6 months ago or a year ago, which is truly astonishing. So kudos to you for that. And there is one sentence that I like especially, and that is the following. You write, the network economy is founded on technology, but can only be built on relationships. It starts with the chips and hence with trust. Now, this means that to be the one person enabling adoption, you need to be able to find a mechanism to create trust. And here's my question. Did you uncover over the years some patterns as to how a company can create trust? And I'm asking because to me, it seems very scattered. We see that Bitcoin created trust by limited supply, and because Satoshi Nakamoto disappeared, we see that Uber and Airbnb created trust by allowing customers to grade services and to insure those customers. We saw that Facebook created trust by using university affiliation and real-life identity. So those are very different techniques, and I do not see any general rules for how to approach that trust issue. And my question is whether or not you've seen a couple patterns.
And then there is this sort of erosion of trust that many people feel right now due to social media. So I, I think you're right. I think you're right that we don't have a general theory of trust, and that's if someone wants to have a frontier to work on. There's one, because we're going to have a whole bunch of AI agents coming along, and the question is going to be, can we trust them? Are they trustworthy? How do we know that's trustworthy? And what's the formula for that? And it's a real frontier.
What we know is that once you lose trust, it's very hard to gain it back. And in fact, we know that from surveys, the number one reason why amongst the people who are not using Facebook, they are indeed not using it, is because of a trust issue, which is very problematic for the company, especially when they now try to implement AI. So what we lack is a general theory of trust, a general theory of innovation, and or technology, but it doesn't mean that we know nothing of technology. And that leads me to part 2 of our discussion, in which we explore the scaling laws, starting with the decreasing cost over time, which probably is the most famous of all because it relates to Moore's law. So you do explain that he actually began tracking actual statistics of the earliest prototype chips, and by 64 was able to come up with the beginning of a theory. Just as a reminder, the idea is that the number of transistors on a microchip roughly double every 2 years, which means that for the same cost, you can actually double power pretty much. You do explain that the inventor, Ray Kurzweil, showed something like Moore's law had an origin that actually dated far back before Moore's law actually came up with the concept. This applies to the number of calculation per seconds you could perform with turn-of-the-century analog machines and mechanical calculators and so on and so forth. So that is pretty well documented. Now, my question to you is, what explains Moore's law and this idea that the cost will decrease over time? And you give more examples when it comes to hard disks, bandwidth, DNA sequencing. So is it a physical constraint that explains that? Is it maybe a psychological constraint? The idea would be, I guess, that unconsciously we hold back on innovation, not to innovate too fast. Is there an explanation as to why we have Moore's law?
It's a really good question that a number of people have been trying to answer. And in general, there's kind of 2 ways to go. One is to say, and this is the way I was asking it, was Moore's law inevitable? Would it have occurred in another economic regime, another political regime? If you reran the tape, if you reran it again, would it always happen each time in civilization? Would it happen on another planet? And I concluded, in fact, that it would have happened again and again, that it was inevitable for the reasons you kind of stated. That one is that it kept appearing, or it was happening even before people noticed that it was happening. So it wasn't as if we were making a roadmap and that we were forcing it by our own efforts, because we noticed that it was that way, so we kind of made it happen in a deliberate way. I think it's being, and this is the question, it's being driven by the technium itself that would have happened anywhere. And the question was, well, as you were saying, well, why does it happen? Well, first of all, most of the places you see these scaling laws happen were information related. So we weren't seeing it like in aviation. It wasn't that planes were becoming twice as fast every 2 years or twice as heavy every 2 years. And so they were very much information related. But we have seen some of that recently with like solar power. However, solar power is also about photons and intangibles. So my original hypothesis was that this was related to the intangible nature, or that there were technologies where you had an intangible thing like electrons or information or photons, which seemed to obey something different than atoms. So why does it happen? I think it's happening, for me, it's because of the informational component, which allows what they call the learning curve. So the reason why the chips get cheaper and cheaper is not to do about the nature of silicon, the nature of the matrix. It has to do with the fact that we've learned how to do something, and that learning then can accelerate how fast we learn the next thing. So the reason why they can make a chip smaller is the huge amount of learning that's going on, huge amount of effort by many people in making that happen, including the spreading of the information.
Yeah. But so what we know so far is that indeed the speed will increase and it will become cheaper to buy chips, and this will increase adoption. And that leads me to what you call the inevitability of tech evolution, something we already discussed. And actually, you argued that this is a feature and not a bug, because you can actually predict and better prepare yourself for what's coming.
Right.
Now, something I ignored before reading the book is that the Hamish have a methodology as to whether or not they want to adopt new technologies. You explained that they first are very selective, so they don't adopt any new technology. Second, they evaluate new things by experience instead of theory. Something I ignored is that they actually let, when you become a grown-up, they let you drive a car and listen to music and, basically go out there, and then you make a choice as to whether you want to come back. They have criteria by which they make choices, and the choices they make are not individual, but communal.
Right, that's the main thing.
That's the main thing.
Right.
Now, you suggest that a similar methodology could work on individual cases, but if you take a step back and look at the general trend, you also argue, and that's another scaling law, that the prohibitions of technologies are shorter and shorter over centuries. And you give one example of the late 13th century in Florence, in Italy, when they prohibited their bankers from using Arabic numerals in their account. But because the rest of Italy was adopting them, then of course it becomes very hard to keep on prohibiting that in just Florence. So my question is there a call for international regulation? Does it mean that we can only prohibit technology in a way that will be successful at an international level? Or would you say it might be possible to do it, let's say, on the national level?
Yeah. No. At this point, we are becoming a planetary civilization, so everything needs to work. Will only work at the planetary global scale, particularly prohibition. I think generally prohibition doesn't work, except perhaps maybe with weapons. I mean, we've been very successful in prohibiting chemical, biological weapons that we could very easily make, and we have made, but just kind of keeping them down. So with where the harm is so evident, and we have experience with the harm, I think we can regulate self-harm in that sense. I think I think prohibitions of other kinds, generally, what my research showed, are short-lived and not very effective. So prohibitions on AI will be completely misguided, completely routed around, ineffective right now. It's just not going to work. If we had the ability to make some kind of a weapon with AI, and I don't mean using AI on weapons, which is different. I mean making a weapon of AI. I don't think they're going to be effective because it's historically we've always routed around them because the benefits are so much greater, and so the general tack that I suggest in the book and personally is to move away from a precautionary principle for regulation, which says that we should outlaw everything unless we can prove that it doesn't harm us, to a proactionary principle, which says that we should eagerly adopt new technology as soon as possible and monitor it, looking for actual evidence of harm, and use that evidence to regulate, and not just do it once, but do it constantly, continuously. So unlike the FDA, we shouldn't just give a free pass to a molecule. It should be constantly renewed in terms of, as we discover new uses for them, things or new evidence about it. And so there's this idea that we want constant testing of, and then regulation based on evidence, not of imaginary harms, which is very easy to think of, but on actual harms. And so AI is really suffering from that, where people are trying to regulate on what they could imagine might happen. They could imagine people losing jobs, but how many people are losing their jobs? Almost nobody. A couple hundred, couple thousand people. That's out of billions of people. So there is no real harm actually caused by AI in terms of where we are so far. That can change and will change, but we want to have an evidence-based policy and regulation rather than something than an imaginary base where we're imagining what might happen.
Yeah, and we are wired this way. Of course, this is a trait that
fear.
enables survival.
It's just if you do anything out of fear, it's likely to be very stupid.
So, this idea of making regulation adaptive is something we discussed with Yann Lequin, Sarah Hooker on the podcast already. And my bet is that in the next 10 years ahead of us, this is going to have to become kind of the norm, at least for those AI regulations. In the AI Act passed in the EU, there is very little elements of adaptability. The only thing the EU can do eventually is to qualify more systems as being high risk and impose more provisions on them. But we do not monitor, and there is no mechanisms to monitor the effect of the regulation, the effect of the technology, what is success, what is failure, and adapt to the regulation.
So, right. And the other thing in terms of regulation that I want to add, I think when you are trying to do regulation, you have to compare the new regulation to the existing stuff. With AI, like auto-driven cars. Yes, they're going to kill some people, but there are going to be less people killed than not having AI drivers, which will be, we have hundreds of thousands of people killed every year by other humans, millions. It's crazy. So you have to always compare to something else that exists already. And so we often give a pass. We've given a pass to human drivers. We're not going to hold them accountable. I mean, in theory, which is say no humans should be allowed to drive a car unless we could prove that humans are capable of driving at a certain level, and they're not. And so we have to learn to always compare the new technologies to what they're intending to replace or what they're intending to work with, because we often don't assess them in the same way that we're assessing the new technology.
Yeah, I believe this is something that Arvind Narayan, that we also had on the podcast, called the marginal AI risk. So this is the risk that AI creates on top of the ones that exist already. And of course, if AI decreases those risks comparatively to not using AI, then there is a good case for using it. Okay, let me ask two last questions. The first relates to, where does technology go? What you argue and show in the book is that technology tends toward complexity. And you give a couple examples. One might be that the number of lines of code used in each release of the Windows operating system between 1993 and 2003 exploded from 5 million to 50 million. And we see that again, the trend is very linear in that sense, or exponential. The same goes for the numbers of parts used in most complicated machines over the last 2 centuries. My question is this: would you expect that trend to continue for years to come, or is there reasons why it may actually slow down?
No, I fully expect the complexity of what we make to continue to approach biological complexity. I mean, if you want to think about a complex machine, think about our bodies. Unbelievably complex. I mean, even a single cell, the complexity of that, it just dwarfs anything we've made so far, including AI. our brains are far more complex than AI. And even when the number of neurons and the number of transistors are equal, the complexity of our brains is still far vaster than the complexity in a computer or a cluster of computers. So yes, I think the complexity of things will continue to do that, and that's a challenge for us because, like AI, we will continue to make things that work and that will be basically beyond our understanding. That's a new regime for us, and so managing or controlling, let alone trusting, but being able to manage or manipulate or control or steer things that are very complicated is going to be a new skill for us. And so, like, when we're making quantum computers and stuff, there's also going to be this issue of the complexity, not being able to have full control over it, being able to have indirect control, which is sort of the theme of my book, Out of Control, which is that we have to have different forms of working with these complex systems because we can't control them in the way that we could control a steam engine. And so we have to sort of enter in a kind of a different kind of relationships with these things where we accept the fact that there's not 100% mechanical control type of systems like this. We already have that with the internet already, where we cannot eliminate spam and bad stuff. We have to tolerate a certain percentage of just we just don't want to get too much. And that's kind of like the immune system. So the immune system is not saying, well, no bad stuff at all. You can't control things that way. It's accepting a certain amount of cancer or other things in the system. We just don't want it to get out of hand. And so that's more of the approach that we're going to be coming to with these complex technologies and trying to control them, is that we don't have this sort of absolute kind of control that we could, where we can control things down to 3, 6, decimal points. We're going to have a much more organic, biological-like relationship with these things, where it's like an immune system, where most of the time it's doing things, but it hallucinates whatever it is, 0.1% of the time, and we have to kind of work with that seemingly imperfection, which is actually one of its geniuses. And so that's the issue. And so that stance of accepting that as we make things more and more and more complex, our kind of control of them has to shift to something we're more familiar with in biology.
So indeed, it begs very interesting questions related to societal implications of losing control. And, I was reminded when you were answering my question that a couple of weeks ago, I broke my turntable and I was able to repair my turntable myself. And I felt very empowered by that. And I'm now spinning some vinyls every night because I'm very happy that I could do it myself, which of course I could not do with my smartphone or other technologies that we have here. That actually leads me to the last question I want to ask, that relates to the rate of diffusion of technology. And we know and see that it is also accelerating. You provide, again, some great numbers explaining that electrification took 75 years to reach 90% of the US residents. It took about 20 years for the cell phones to reach the same adoption rate. Internet took even more than that. We know that ChatGPT took only 2 months to reach 100 million users. And the very interesting question is, what happens to society when everybody has the technology, or nearly everybody? I guess my question is this: is there a general framework to start to conceptualize the relationship between technology adoption and the impact on society? Or is it something that is, again, out of our understanding so far?
So it's a big question, but let me just make a tangent back to your story about repairing your turntable. you didn't tell me, and I don't know, but I'm going to bet that you were able to repair it with the help of YouTube.
Yeah.
So there is this giant system, AI powered. How did you find the right YouTube thing to look at? It was AI that was helping you find or even suggest what it is that look. So yes, you could repair the turntable, but only with the assistance of this very large system that was teaching you, bringing you the information as you needed it right then to fix it. So you could not have fixed it probably on your own. You wouldn't even know what part to get. You wouldn't know how to do it. You could figure it out, but it would just take you a really, really long time. And so even for the simple things, there is a very complicated, complex system that enabling us to do that. We're beyond being able to just kind of doing it on our own.
What I do very often is actually take a picture of the thing and ask ChatGPT or Claude or one of those, what should I do? And it also works. Yeah.
Right. But that's the point. The point is that it's the fixing part of it is not as simple as it seems. It's actually AI enabled in some ways.
Yeah, the impact of high rates of adoptions on society.
Yeah. So I do think that there's something which we haven't really quantified, and again, we lack a theory about things becoming ubiquitous. That when things become ubiquitous, they kind of flip in some ways. They change, and that there's a huge difference between having 50% of the people having it and having everybody have it. It's quantitatively different. But I think it's going to be more and more difficult to actually reach 100%. And that's simply because we have so many choices and so many technologies and so much options that getting to the point where everybody has it is going to be a long process. And we have all these niche markets. And you have people deciding, and this is my interest in the Amish, that they're going to go this direction, and you can't use all the stuff. You can't, you can't use the jet ski and the vinyl stuff and the newest mask for sleep. You just can't try or use all the stuff, except for some maybe very, very primitive, essential technologies. But even that, I'm not sure if we get it, because I think we've lost that phase of our existence, which was very temporary, because 100, 200 years ago, there wasn't universal adoption of technologies. People were very, very varied in what they were using. And it was only kind of, for me, a brief moment when we had this kind of global adoption where everybody has exactly the same technology. And and again, this is still very rare. There isn't a lot of other things. Well, maybe the car, but they're still not even 100% there. So I think I'm trying to temper this idea that we're going to all rush to 100% adoption faster and faster. And AI is an example. Yes, everybody tried ChatGPT, but what we're going to see is we have multiple kinds of AIs. So that's just everyone tried the first one, but over time, I think we're going to have very diverse kinds of AIs that may take a while to get 100% adoption, if they do at all. And so I think as I said, we go from the general. Right now, there's the general AI, and then we're going to go to speciate. We're not going to go to like more and more general AI. That will be one type. But most of the AIs in your life in the future are going to be these other species of AIs. Dumber AIs that are good for conversation but not for driving, AIs that drive well but don't have a good conversation. And so AI will be present everywhere, but it's not going to be uniform. It's not a single technology.
So it's one of the scaling laws that might be pending in years to come.
Well, I would say the pattern is that it's like technology. You have the general scaling law, and then over time, as they speciate, they have their own scaling law.
Yeah, so it's a fractal system. And indeed, to come back to your graphic, you do mention electricity or radio and airplanes, but not the very specific types of each. So indeed, is more on the general spectrum.
Right. AI is inevitable, but a particular kind of AI is not.
I think on that, it's time to conclude the conversation, but thank you so very much. The book is very inspiring. To everyone out there, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.